What if the life you are living right now is not even close to the life you are capable of living? And the most terrifying part is not that you do not know it, but that somewhere deep inside, you already do, and you're still choosing to stay exactly where you are, doing the same things, thinking the same thoughts, and waiting for something outside of you to finally come and change everything. That question is not comfortable, and it is not supposed to be, because comfort is exactly what has been keeping you stuck, and today, that changes. Welcome to English to Inspire, the channel where you learn real English while learning something far more important, which is how to take your life seriously, how to push past fear, and how to become the kind of person you were always meant to be. One story at a time, one word at a time, one decision at a time. If this is your first time here, then you arrived at exactly the right moment. And if you want to keep receiving this kind of content, take a second right now and subscribe to the channel, because what we build here together is not just vocabulary, it is a vision for your life. Today, the story you are going to hear belongs to a man who grew up with almost nothing, who experienced hunger not just for food but for meaning, for safety, for someone to tell him that he mattered, and who somehow transformed all of that raw and devastating pain into a force so powerful that it would eventually touch the lives of more than 50 million people across the world. His name is Tony Robbins, and before he was the giant who coached presidents and billionaires, before he was the man filling stadiums with thousands of people on fire for their futures, he was a broken and frightened boy, living in a home where love was not guaranteed and the next meal was not certain. What makes Tony Robbins worth studying is not just his success, because the world is full of successful people who cannot teach you anything real, but the specific path he walked to get there, which was a path made entirely of decisions, not luck, not talent handed down from birth, not a safety net that caught him every time he fell, but decisions, cold and deliberate, and made in the darkest possible moments, when giving up would have been the easiest and most understandable thing in the world. And that is what makes his story dangerous, in the best possible way. Because if he built what he built from where he started, then the excuses you're currently holding on to become very, very difficult to justify. So before we go back to the beginning of his story, before we walk into the house where he grew up and feel the tension and the fear and the uncertainty that shaped him, ask yourself one honest question and actually sit with the answer, which is this: what are you currently doing with the one life you have been given? And is it enough? And if the answer is no, then you are in exactly the right place. Because the story that begins now was built specifically for people who are not yet done becoming who they are supposed to be. There are children who grow up learning that the world is safe, that adults can be trusted, that food will be on the table, and that the person who tucks them in at night will still be there in the morning. And then there are children who learn the opposite of all of that before they are old enough to even understand what they are losing. And Tony Robbins was one of those children. Born in North Hollywood, California, on the 29th of February, 1960, into a home where stability was a stranger, and tension was the only thing you could count on to always show up. His mother, Nikki, was a woman who was herself deeply wounded, a person fighting battles inside her own mind that she did not have the tools to win, and those battles spilled outward and landed on the children around her, including a young Tony who learned very early that love in his house could turn into something frightening without warning, that the atmosphere could shift from calm to violent in the time it took to say the wrong word or make the wrong sound, and that survival in that environment required a level of emotional alertness that no child should ever have to develop before they learn to ride a bicycle. His parents divorced when he was 7 years old, and what followed was a series of stepfathers moving in and out of the house, each one bringing a different kind of instability. And through all of it, Tony watched his mother's pain deepen and her behavior become more erratic and more dependent on substances that was supposed to numb her suffering but only made the home more unpredictable and more dangerous. And the young boy who would one day teach millions of people how to take control of their emotional state was learning in real time what it felt like to have absolutely no control over anything at all. What is remarkable, though, and what you must not miss as you listen to this, is that even in the middle of all of that chaos, there was something stirring inside Tony that refused to accept his environment as his destiny. And he began to read, obsessively and hungrily, pulling books from wherever he could find them, because books were the one place where the world made sense, where people solved problems instead of creating them, where the future was something you could actually shape with your hands and your mind and your will. And that hunger for understanding, that desperate need to find the answers to why some lives worked and others collapsed, became the fuel that would eventually drive everything he built. By the time Tony was a teenager, the household had become almost unbearable, and there came a moment when his mother chased him out of the house with a knife, and he stood outside in the night air and understood, with complete clarity, that he could not wait for that environment to change, that no one was coming to rescue him, that the only person responsible for the direction of his life was the person standing in his own shoes. And although that realization arrived wrapped in pain and fear and confusion, it was also the first real seed of the philosophy that would one day make him one of the most recognized voices on the subject of human transformation in the entire history of the modern world. There is a moment in some people's lives, and it does not always arrive gently, where everything that has been building underneath the surface finally breaks through, and the person standing in the middle of that moment has to make a choice that will quietly determine the entire direction of their existence. And most people, when that moment comes, do not recognize it for what it is. They simply feel the pain and look for the fastest way to make it stop. But every once in a while, someone stands inside that moment, and instead of running from it, they grab it with both hands and decide to use it. And that is exactly what Tony Robbins did at the age of 17. He had left home because staying was no longer a survivable option, and he was living alone in a small apartment that he could barely afford, working whatever jobs he could find to keep himself fed and sheltered, and there was nothing romantic or adventurous about it. It was simply a young man with no support system, no financial safety net, no mentor standing nearby with wisdom and encouragement. Just the raw and grinding reality of survival. And the loneliness of that period was something he would later describe, not with bitterness, but with a kind of gratitude, because it was inside that loneliness that he was forced to have the most important conversations of his life, which were the conversations he had with himself. It was during this time that Tony began to ask questions that most 17-year-olds are nowhere near ready to ask. Questions like, why do some people succeed and others fail, even when they seem to have similar abilities? Why do some people rise from destruction and others get buried by it? What is the actual difference between a life that expands and a life that contracts? And he did not ask these questions casually or academically, but with the urgency of someone who understood that the answers were not just intellectually interesting, but personally necessary. Because without them, he had no map. And without a map, a young man alone in the world has nothing to navigate by except fear. He made a decision during this period that is easy to describe in a single sentence, but almost impossible to fully understand unless you have stood in a similar place, which was the decision to take 100% responsibility for his life. Not 50%, not the portion that felt fair, given what he had been through, not the amount that society might reasonably expect from someone with his background, but everything. The whole weight of his future placed entirely on his own shoulders, with no blame assigned to his mother or his circumstances or the world that had not exactly welcomed him with open arms. And that decision, made quietly and without applause, was the true beginning of Tony Robbins. And what you need to understand, what you need to sit with as you listen to this right now, is that Tony was not special in the way that most people use that word. He did not have gifts that arrived at birth wrapped in guarantees. He was not protected from suffering by talent or beauty or connection. He was a teenager alone in an apartment who was tired of being a victim of his own story. And the only extraordinary thing he did in that moment was refuse. Refuse to accept the narrative that his past had written for him. Refuse to let his origin become his destination. And that kind of refusal is not something that is given to certain people and denied to others. It is a choice. And the fact that it is a choice means that it is available to you right now, today. in whatever room you are sitting in as you listen to these words. There's something that the most transformed people in the world almost always have in common. And it is not that they were born with more courage, or more intelligence, or more natural ability than the people around them, but that at some critical point in their journey, they encountered a voice, a presence, a teacher whose words landed in exactly the right place at exactly the right time, and cracked something open inside them that had been closed for years. And for Tony Robbins, still young and still hungry and still building the foundation of a philosophy he could not yet fully articulate, that voice belonged to a man named Jim Rohn. Jim Rohn was a speaker and philosopher of personal development who had himself risen from a farm in Idaho with very little and built a life of meaning and influence through the disciplined application of simple but profound ideas. And when Tony first encountered his work, it was like hearing someone describe the invisible architecture of the world for the very first time. Because Jim Rohn did not speak in complicated theories or academic language, but in plain and powerful truths that felt like things you had always known, somewhere beneath the surface, but had never had the words to express. And for a young man who had been searching desperately for a framework to make sense of human behavior and human potential, this was nothing short of a revelation. Tony began to absorb everything Jim Rohn produced with the kind of total and consuming focus that only becomes possible when you are genuinely starving for something. And what he found in those teachings was a set of principles that would become the bedrock of his own philosophy for the rest of his life. Ideas like the understanding that your life does not get better by chance, but by change. That you cannot change your destination overnight, but you can change your direction. That the discipline you apply to the smallest daily actions is the same discipline that eventually builds an extraordinary existence. And Tony did not just consume these ideas intellectually, but tested them immediately and relentlessly against the raw material of his own daily life. What happened next is the part of the story that people often overlook when they talk about mentorship. Because most people think of a mentor as someone who holds your hand and walks beside you and makes the path easier. But what Jim Rohn actually gave Tony was something far more demanding than comfort, which was standards. A clear and unforgiving picture of what a human being was capable of when they stopped negotiating with their own potential and started taking the full measure of their gifts seriously. And Tony, who had spent his entire childhood in an environment where standards were absent and chaos was the norm, responded to that picture with a hunger that surprised even himself. And here is the question that this part of Tony's story quietly places in front of you, which is whether you currently have a voice in your life that is pulling you upward. A book or a teacher or a community that is showing you a version of yourself that is larger and more capable than the one you see in the mirror every morning. Because the truth that Jim Rohn gave Tony, and that Tony has spent his entire career giving to others, is this: you become the average of the people and the ideas you surround yourself with most consistently. And if the voices around you right now are not lifting you, if the ideas filling your mind each day are not expanding you, then the ceiling you are bumping against is not made of circumstance but of choice, and a ceiling made of choice can always be raised. There is a version of ambition that looks clean and straight from the outside, where someone decides what they want, works hard, and arrives at success in a way that makes a satisfying and logical story. And then there is the version that most people who actually build something real will recognize, which is messy and humbling and full of moments where the distance between where you are and where you are trying to go feels not just large but almost laughable. And when Tony Robbins began his career as a speaker and a coach in the early 1980s, he was living that second version completely, working not from a stage bathed in spotlight, but from the ground floor of obscurity where nobody knew his name and nobody was waiting for what he had to say. He was working as a janitor at the time, cleaning floors and bathrooms to pay his rent. And there is something important that you must not rush past in that detail. Because the image of a young man mopping a floor while carrying inside him an unshakable conviction that he was going to change the way human beings understood themselves and their potential is not a story of delusion, but a story of identity. Because Tony had already decided who he was before the world had agreed to confirm it. And that gap between the identity you have chosen and the reality the world is currently showing you is the exact space where most people give up, where most dreams quietly dissolve not from a single dramatic failure, but from the slow and grinding exhaustion of not being recognized yet. He began promoting seminars, not his own at first, but those of others, knocking on doors and making phone calls and learning the mechanics of how ideas move from one person to another, and how a room full of strangers can be transformed into a community of people who believe that their lives can be different. And he was not particularly polished in those early days. He was not the finished and magnetic presence that would later fill arenas. He was a young man with enormous energy and genuine belief, and the kind of relentless work ethic that comes not from discipline alone, but from the specific desperation of someone who has already decided that going backward is simply not an available option. His personal life during this period was equally stripped down and demanding, as he was living in a 400-square-foot apartment in Venice, California, washing his dishes in the bathtub because the kitchen sink was broken, and eating at the same fast food restaurant with enough regularity that the staff knew his order by heart. And rather than hide these details or feel ashamed of them in retrospect, he has spoken about them openly and often, because they are not the embarrassing prelude to his real life, but the actual foundation of it. The period where the gap between his vision and his reality forced him to develop a relationship with discomfort that would later become one of the central teachings of everything he built. And what this period of Tony's life is asking you directly, right now, is whether you are willing to be unknown for as long as it takes, whether you are capable of doing the work before the reward arrives, before anyone is watching, before the results justify the effort. Because the janitor mopping the floor and the speaker filling the stadium are not two different people, separated by luck or timing, but the same person separated only by the decision to keep going past the point where keeping going stopped making obvious sense. And that decision, that specific and unglamorous and deeply personal decision, is the one that is sitting in front of you right now, waiting to see what you will do with it. Every person who has ever built something meaningful has a chapter in their story that they did not plan for and would not have chosen. A chapter where the momentum they worked so hard to create suddenly stops, where the confidence they carefully constructed begins to crack, where the version of themselves they were so certain they were becoming starts to feel uncertain and distant and maybe even naive. And Tony Robbins, for all his extraordinary drive and focus and belief in human potential, was absolutely not exempt from that chapter, because the universe does not give exemptions. It gives lessons, and the lessons it gave Tony in the middle years of his journey were some of the most brutal and clarifying of his entire life. The first major collision came in the form of his physical health, because Tony had been operating at a pace that most human bodies are simply not designed to sustain, pouring every unit of energy he possessed into his work while neglecting the very instrument he was using to do it. And the result was a body that began to show the consequences of that neglect in ways that were impossible to ignore. As his weight climbed and his energy became inconsistent, and the gap between the vitality he preached about on stage and the vitality he was actually experiencing in his private life grew wide enough to become a source of genuine internal conflict for a man whose entire identity was built around the idea of mastery. There were also business failures during this period, ventures that did not produce what they promised, partnerships that unraveled in expensive and painful ways, financial pressures that arrived precisely when he had begun to believe that he had moved past the kind of scarcity that defined his childhood. And what made these failures particularly instructive was not the losses themselves, but what they revealed about the places inside Tony, where fear and ego and unresolved patterns from his past were still quietly operating beneath the surface of all the personal development work he had done. Because growth is never as complete as it looks from the outside, and the deepest wounds have a way of waiting patiently for the moment when you are most confident before they reintroduce themselves. His relationships during this time also suffered, as the same relentless focus that made him extraordinary in a professional context made genuine sustained intimacy difficult. Because presence is the one thing that cannot be faked in a personal relationship, and Tony was often physically in one place, while his mind and energy were somewhere else entirely. And he would later acknowledge with unusual honesty that the skills he was teaching others about emotional connection and authentic communication were skills he was still actively struggling to embody in his own most private and vulnerable relationships. And that honesty, that refusal to present a version of himself that was cleaner than the truth, is one of the things that makes his story worth trusting. What this chapter of his life teaches you is something that no highlight reel and no motivational quote posted on a wall will ever show you, which is that the path to an extraordinary life is not a straight line moving upward, but a jagged and unpredictable terrain full of drops that feel permanent and detours that feel like punishment. And the difference between the people who eventually arrive and the people who do not is not that the arrivals never fell, but that they developed a specific relationship with falling. One where the ground is not the end of the story, but simply the place from which the next decision gets made. And every single time Tony hit the ground, he got up, not because it was easy, but because he had long ago made a decision that made staying down impossible. There comes a point in the life of someone who is truly committed to their purpose, where all of the pain they have absorbed and all of the lessons they have survived and all of the failures they have refused to be defined by begin to crystallize into something coherent and powerful and entirely their own, where the scattered pieces of a life lived at full intensity suddenly arrange themselves into a system, a method, a repeatable and transferable technology for human transformation. And for Tony Robbins, that crystallization produced something that the world had genuinely never seen before. A live experience so intense and so carefully engineered that it did not just inspire the people inside the room, but fundamentally altered the way they understood what they were capable of feeling and doing and becoming. The seminar was called Unleash the Power Within, and while the name might sound like something you have heard before, the actual experience of it was unlike anything the personal development world had produced up to that point. Because Tony was not interested in simply motivating people with stories and energy and applause. He understood from his own journey that motivation without a method was temporary, that a person could leave a seminar feeling incredible and return to exactly the same life within 72 hours, if the experience had only touched their emotions without restructuring the deeper patterns driving their behavior. And so, he built something that operated on multiple levels simultaneously, addressing the body and the mind and the emotional history of each person in the room at the same time. The firewalk became the signature moment of this experience, and it is worth understanding what the firewalk actually represents, because it is easy to dismiss it as a spectacle or a gimmick. If you have never stood at the edge of a bed of burning coals at 11 o'clock at night surrounded by thousands of other human beings who are also terrified, because what Tony had discovered through years of studying human psychology and peak performance was that the body keeps a record of every limitation the mind has ever accepted, and that in order to install a new belief at the deepest possible level, you sometimes need to give the nervous system an experience so undeniable and so physical that the old story of what is possible simply cannot survive it. Thousands of people walked across those coals, ordinary people who had arrived at the seminar carrying the weight of their fears and their histories, and their carefully maintained reasons for why their lives could not be different. And on the other side of that walk, something shifted in them that was not just psychological but cellular. And Tony had engineered that shift deliberately, had studied the precise sequence of mental and emotional states that needed to be activated in a specific order to move a human being from paralysis to power. And the fact that it worked consistently across thousands of different people from thousands of different backgrounds was not magic, but science. The science of human state management applied at the highest possible level. And what Tony was building through all of this was not just a business or a brand, but a proof of concept for the central idea that had been driving him since he was a teenager alone in an apartment, asking questions that felt too large for one person to hold, which was the idea that human suffering is not inevitable, that the patterns producing pain in a person's life are not permanent features of their character, but learned responses that can be identified and interrupted and replaced, and that the distance between the life a person is living and the life they are capable of living is almost never a question of resources, but always, without exception, a question of the decisions they are willing to make about who they are and what they deserve and what they are finally ready to do about it. There is a particular kind of success that arrives slowly and then all at once, while years of invisible work and incremental progress and stubborn refusal to quit suddenly reach a threshold and everything accelerates in a way that feels almost disorienting to the person experiencing it. Where the world that spent so long ignoring you begins to pay attention with an intensity that is equal to and sometimes greater than the intensity of the silence that came before it. And that is precisely what happened to Tony Robbins, as the 1980s gave way to the 90s, and the 90s gave way to a new century. Because the foundation he had built through all those years of grinding and failing and rebuilding was finally strong enough to hold the weight of something enormous. The cassette tape programs he produced in the 80s, most notably Personal Power, became one of the best-selling self-help audio programs in history, reaching millions of households through late-night television infomercials that ran at a time when most people were skeptical that a young man with no formal education and an almost aggressive level of enthusiasm could deliver anything of genuine and lasting value. And yet the results people reported were real and documented and widespread enough that the skepticism slowly gave way to recognition. And the recognition opened doors that led to other doors. And Tony walked through every single one of them with the same hunger and the same work ethic that had carried him through the years when no doors were opening at all. He began working with figures whose names carry a weight that most people only encounter in history books and newspaper headlines, coaching athletes, preparing for championships, and executives, navigating decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars in Politico, leaders managing pressures that would collapse most ordinary human beings. And what he brought to each of those relationships was not a generic formula, applied uniformly, but a razor-sharp ability to identify the specific pattern of thinking that was limiting that specific person, and then apply exactly the right intervention at exactly the right moment to shift it. And the consistency with which that approach produced results across such radically different contexts was the clearest possible evidence that what Tony had developed was not a personality, but a genuine and transferable technology. His business empire expanded to include not just seminars and audio programs, but books, coaching organizations, investment holdings, and a portfolio of companies across industries as varied as health, finance, and media. And the scale of that expansion was not accidental, but the direct result of applying to his own financial life the same principles of clarity and strategy and massive action that he had been teaching others for decades. Because Tony Robbins has never been someone who separates what he teaches from how he lives, and the congruence between his message and his choices, imperfect as those choices sometimes were, gave everything. He produced a credibility that purely academic or theoretical self-help material almost never achieves. What the arc of Tony's ascent from cassette tapes sold through late-night television to coaching the most powerful people on the planet is really showing you is something about the nature of compound effort, which is the understanding that the work you do today, in the absence of any visible result, is not wasted but is instead being stored, accumulating quietly beneath the surface of your life, like water filling a reservoir. And the day will come when that reservoir reaches capacity and everything you have been pouring into it will begin to flow outward with a force that surprises even you. But only if you keep pouring. Only if you refuse to stop during the long and unrewarded middle. Only if you trust the process enough to stay faithful to it before the evidence arrives, to justify your faith. There is a difference between a person who has achieved success and a person who has understood it, and that difference matters enormously, because achievement without understanding is fragile. It depends on conditions remaining favorable and circumstances staying cooperative. But understanding is something you carry inside you that no external force can take away. And what separates Tony Robbins from the vast majority of people who have built large invisible lives is not the size of what he accumulated, but the depth of what he comprehended about why human beings do what they do and how that doing can be changed. And it is that comprehension, refined over decades of working with millions of people across every conceivable background and culture and level of privilege, that represents his most enduring and most transferable contribution to the world. The framework he developed and taught and refined over his entire career rests on three interconnected pillars that he calls state, story, and strategy. And while those 3 words are simple enough to fit on a single line, they contain within them a complete and coherent model of human behavior that, once genuinely understood, makes it almost impossible to look at your own life the same way again. Because what Tony discovered through working with everyone from people in crisis to people at the absolute peak of their fields is that the quality of every decision a person makes is determined first by the emotional and physical state they are in when they make it, then by the story they are telling themselves about who they are and what is possible, and only then by the specific strategies they employ to move toward what they want. Most people, Tony argues, spend the majority of their energy on strategy, looking for the right plan, the right method, the right sequence of steps that will finally produce the result they are after, while almost entirely ignoring the state and the story underneath. And the result is that they apply excellent strategies from a compromised state while running a limiting story, which is roughly equivalent to trying to fill a bucket that has a hole in the bottom. Because no strategy, however well designed, can consistently produce extraordinary results when it is being operated by a person who feels defeated, who believes the evidence of their past is the verdict on their future, who is asking small questions and therefore receiving small answers from the world around them. The question is the key, and Tony returns to this idea again and again throughout his work with an insistence that reflects how deeply he believes it, because he has observed across millions of interactions that the questions a person habitually asks themselves determine the direction their attention moves, and where attention goes, energy flows, and where energy flows, results grow. And so the person who asks themselves every morning why nothing ever works for them will find their mind dutifully and efficiently searching for evidence to confirm that story, while the person who asks, "What is one thing I can do today that would move my life forward?" will find their mind equally dutifully searching for that answer instead. And the difference in the lives those 2 people build over 10 or 20 years is not small, but total. What Tony Robbins ultimately teaches, stripped of every seminar and every book and every coaching session and every firewalk and every arena filled with thousands of people on their feet, is something almost embarrassingly simple but almost impossibly difficult to actually live, which is that you are not your history, that the patterns running your life right now are not your identity, but your programming, and that programming can be changed, not easily, and not without discomfort, and not without the willingness to look honestly at the stories you've been telling yourself about why your life looks the way it does. But it can be changed. And the moment you genuinely accept that it can be changed is the moment your entire relationship with your future shifts from one of hoping to one of building. And that shift is waiting for you, right now, in this exact moment, asking you what you are finally ready to decide. You have been listening to the story of a boy who had every reason the world would accept to become nothing, who grew up inside chaos and scarcity and violence, and still somehow found inside himself a decision that no circumstance could make for him, and no circumstance could take away from him. And that decision was simply this: that his past was the raw material of his strength and not the boundary of his potential. And he picked up that raw material with both hands, and he built something with it that the world is still feeling decades later. And now the story has arrived at the place where it stops being about Tony Robbins and starts being entirely and uncomfortably about you. Because here's the truth, that this entire story has been quietly walking you to, which is that inspiration without action is just entertainment. And you have consumed enough entertainment in your life already. You have watched enough stories of remarkable people and felt the warmth of their courage from a safe and comfortable distance, and then returned to the same habits and the same excuses and the same version of yourself that you have been maintaining for longer than you know is acceptable. And today that cycle has to break. Not tomorrow, not when the conditions are better, not when you feel more ready. Because readiness is a feeling that arrives after the action and not before it, and waiting for it is the oldest and most expensive mistake a human being can make. Tony Robbins did not wait until his childhood was healed before he decided to grow. He did not wait until the apartment was bigger or the bank account was fuller or the world had given him some sign that it was safe to try. He made the decision in the dark, alone, with nothing confirmed and nothing guaranteed, and the decision itself was the thing that began to change everything. Not the results of the decision, but the decision itself, the moment of total and unconditional commitment to a direction. And that same decision is available to you right now in this moment, with the same power and the same potential it had when a 17-year-old boy made it alone in a small apartment in California with nothing but hunger and refusal to guide him. So, ask yourself, and ask yourself honestly without the comfortable softening you usually apply to questions this important. What decision have you been postponing? What commitment have you been approaching halfway? What version of yourself have you been keeping locked behind the door of your own fear and your own doubt, and your own deeply practiced habit of choosing the familiar over the possible? Because that version of you is not gone. It is waiting. It has always been waiting. And the only thing standing between the life you are living and the life you are capable of living is the quality of the decision you are willing to make right now, in this exact moment. The world does not need another person who almost became who they were supposed to be, who came close and then retreated, who felt the fire and then stepped back from it because the heat was real and the outcome was uncertain, and the easier path was always right there, offering its predictable and diminishing comfort. And you did not find this story today by accident. You found it because something in you is still awake, still hungry, still unfinished. And that hunger is not a problem to be managed, but a signal to be followed. So follow it. Make the decision. Take the step. And do not let another day pass where the most important person in your story remains a supporting character in their own life. Because the clock is running. It has always been running. And it will not stop to wait for you to feel ready.